Hello everybody, welcome. My name's Scott Maier. This is Drawing Together with Artists Network, where we meet every Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So this is what we're working on today, this drawing of fabric. And so if you are new, you're going to want to know that you can draw along with us. That's the hope in this show is that you take some time out of your busy day to kind of dedicate to your drawing practice. And so if you want to draw along and you're looking for the reference image, the one that's right below me on the screen, you'll find that in the description below, where you'll also find a link to the show page where you can share your work when you're done. So you can find the show page on artistnetwork.com. So welcome back, everybody. We got a lot of familiar names and faces. I do hope that we do not repeat what happened last week, which was this rather disturbing kind of hijack of the chat stream. But again, thank you to all of you who helped along with that. If you are new, I'd love to hear where you are viewing from. This is all about us drawing together. I'm going to talk through some of the decisions that I make, some of the techniques that I use throughout the drawing process, but I also want to encourage you to share your own thoughts, observations, questions. It's all good. We're here to talk about art, we're here to talk about drawing, and we're here to simply kind of work together. So, all right, I just want to read through some of the chats a little bit. I've been reading some of them. Michelle, you had some kind of concerns, I guess, about the subject that hopefully we'll address that. How do we get the proportions right, get the spacing, etc. We have Wilma saying it also looks like it'll be a challenge for you. So hopefully this is a good challenge, hopefully a healthy challenge. That's why I choose this, because we choose a new subject every week to challenge ourselves in very specific ways, because we're trying to develop these particular skills. What kind of stood out for me in the challenge of this is really dealing with the subtlety. And what I found is that I ended up sticking with this drawing a lot longer than I kind of had anticipated. There is a lot going on, but it's also a singular object. It's a piece of fabric that's hanging here. And so it's on one level, you can kind of look at it and say, well, I'm just drawing one thing. But that one thing seems to have a lot of complex parts. And the advantage, or the opportunity here with this subject, is to develop skills for controlling edges, managing subtle value relationships, controlling proportions, understanding light and shadow, and taking these skills to build into something like figure drawing or some other equally complex form. So that's kind of one of the benefits, again, of choosing a subject like this, is that it can have a correlation to other things that may be very different. Or you might be a portrait artist and you incorporate fabric in a lot of your subjects, and this could be a way to kind of address that as well. So again, welcome everybody. Lady Hawk Leslie, it looks like your status as a moderator has been maintained for this as well. So if we do have any riffraff in the chat like we had last week, if you feel so inclined to take care of them, awesome. If anybody else wants to become a moderator to help, we'll see how that works. But I appreciate all of the efforts you made last week to allow us to move forward. Now, speaking of last week, we worked on the statue of David. I posted an edited version of that that kind of extracted out a lot of the issues with the chat. So if you are interested in watching that again, you'll find that on the Artist Network YouTube channel. So let's get to it. What do we have for materials here? I have this. This is a cotton rag paper. I believe this is the Rives BFK. I have it untaped on this side just so it has that dark strip below me, the reference image. And so I got rid of that, but it's taped down. I'm working in charcoal, so I have just a bit of this vine charcoal that I'll be working with to build up the initial stages. I've got 3 of these Primo Euroblend charcoals. These are awesome. I love these. So General Spencer sent these out. So what I have the HB, which is the harder one, a little bit lighter. I've got the B, which is the next step up, a little bit softer, darker marks, and then the 3B, which is my softest one. So I have a variety of them. I don't know if I'll actually be using the darkest darks. In this subject, we don't have an extensive range, especially in those darkest darks. But we're going to be talking about value ranges in this to see what we can learn there. Trusty blending stump, I think that's going to come in useful We didn't really use it much last week. This one, I've been using it for a long time, so I just need to pull it out a little bit because it's kind of gets squished. Paper towel is going to come in really handy to help blend things down, because what you're going to see me do at least is to build up the drawing, wipe it down, build it up, wipe it down, and just going to keep that whole process to help really manage edges and subtlety a bit more effectively. That typically kind of is my process of laying things down, wiping it down to unify the drawing, and then gradually increasing the clarity throughout the whole process. And then finally, I have my 2 erasers here. I've got my kneaded eraser and my retractable eraser here. This is a Derwent one. I love this, whereas I have it shaved down to this chisel tip so that I have a nice sharp edge. So, whew, long introduction there. Let's get drawing. Again, if you have any questions, comments, observations, thoughts, throw them out in the chat there. I'm going to do my best to monitor as we go. Welcome, everybody. It's good to have you here. So, as always, got to kind of warm up, get my head in the game. Now, Michelle, you had posted earlier in the chat, kind of questions about how we're going to manage the spacing and the placement of things. So we're going to address that. My general flow, though, is to initiate the drawing with a gesture. This just gets information on the page, and then information there, we can start to make specific decisions. The placement, the spacing of these folds. And so I'm just kind of reacting to the form, moving my eyes quickly back and forth. So I'm looking at the screen in front of me that shows exactly what you're seeing. So I see myself, and then I see the small thumbnail below me. That's what I'm using as a reference. I have a larger reference off to the left that gives me a little bit more information, but I don't want to have that available to me now because that's too much information. My eyes are blurred because I'm trying to take in the totality of the scene, and I'm just moving quickly back and forth, looking at the reference, down at the paper, and then to the screen next to me to see what's actually playing out there. And it looks like that's getting blown out. Let me drop that down. That's a little bit better. I might have later as the camera adjusts a bit of the exposure. Oh, you know what? Some of this reference is getting cropped. There we go. And that's kind of a critical critical piece is these little elements on the left side of the drawing. So I'm looking at some of these angles in here. So again, at this stage, my goal is to simply react to the drawing. I'm connecting my body, the materials, my brain, trying to get my head in the game. Not a lot of pressure right now to get anything right. I'm just trying to get it down there and kind of set the tone for the drawing. The advantage to squinting the eyes is that it prioritizes these larger shapes, and it kind of promotes the mentality of treating these marks as abstractions. I'm trying not to think about these as folds. I'm trying not to become aware of all the complexity in this. I'm trying to see the simplicity in the scene as much as possible. And that's aligning with my understanding of the subject. So the drawing will progress in correlation with my understanding of the subject. I haven't taken a lot of time to really study this today. I did this drawing a long time ago. I'm kind of reorienting myself to the subject. And because I have a very surface and kind of basic understanding of this subject, my drawing is going to reflect that. And as I sit with it throughout the drawing process, I'm going to come to understand the subject better, more deeply, with greater kind of clarity and depth, and the drawing will hopefully reflect that. And through the drawing process, it'll get me to a deeper understanding. So it's all about this relationship between observing and reacting, and allowing the drawing process to become understand the world around us more deeply. And so to get back to your comments earlier, from this initial gesture, we can start to make specific decisions about the proportions, the spacing, etc. So I pinned a link at the top of the chat to my new book, See, Think, Draw is the name of the book. And in it, I break down the process. It's all built on doing these projects like we do here in the show. The idea that each project gives us an opportunity to develop and enhance certain skills. And I break each project down into basic stages of starting with a gesture, moving into correction, and then gradually refining the process. And so some subjects may require more time being spent on adjusting proportions and correcting. Some may require more time on some of the finishing stages. Some you may hang out in the early stages of the gesture drawing a little bit longer. But it's within that, by kind of breaking it down into these steps, you're going to find your own way through this. I'm going to kind of show you the way I kind of break down a subject when I'm drawing, but hopefully out of all of this, you'll find your own way through it. And so what I mean by that is that when we're working from life, we're making certain decisions about proportions, about value, texture, edges, all of those things. But you may kind of navigate through that in a slightly different way. You may put proportions before a gesture. You maybe want to work out those proportions first. And then come back in and add some of the gesture. Or maybe you like to start with greater control over the edges and then build values. Maybe you want to build values first and then go, deal with edges or line work. There's no one way to do it, and that's the advantage to us working together, is that we can share some of those ideas and learn from one another. So on that note, if you have any observations, any contrary processes and approaches to drawing that you think could be beneficial, throw that out there. I'm always interested in seeing how other people tackle a subject. All right. I'm kind of need to get focused on the drawing because I was supposed to, my mind started to go down this rabbit hole thinking about all this other stuff. But that's one of the benefits of drawing, is that it brings us here, focuses the mind, connects us to the body. Whew, okay. Oh, let's see. Nia, I'll make you a moderator. Awesome. So now, Nia, you're a moderator, and so is Lady Hawk Leslie. Hello, everybody. A few deep breaths here to kind of get in the game. So much of the drawing process is, for me, the majority of the drawing process is about what's happening here, right? And also aligns with what's happening kind of emotionally. It's cognitive, it's emotional, it's physical, it's all of those things. And so I got to kind of get my head in the game. And so I feel like it just makes for a deeper and richer experience when it's more than just the subject that we're focusing on. It's all about the experience, right? See, drawing is an experience, and it results in a drawing. So let's see. Welcome back, Wilma. Hello, hello. I just wanted to see. I'm not seeing any specific questions, but if you have it. Okay. Now, there are two kind of main issues as we start to correct the proportions. There's the spacing, and then there's the shape. All right, so we want to make sure that we get the shapes correct and we get the size and the relationship between those shapes correct. So how do I want to tackle this? And I'm asking myself that question, and I guess I'm asking you that as well. But that's kind of what I do when I paint and draw. There's part of the drawing process where it's trying to abandon the processes from the past and try to envision this as though it's something entirely new, and be open to trying out a new process or thinking about it in a different way. And so I kind of have to ask myself, rather than relying on a kind of a set, I suppose, for the drawing, I'm going to see where do I need to go first. All right, and I think what I'm being kind of called to right now is figure out where the center is in the drawing. So somewhere right around here, and I'm just kind of loosely envisioning the center by observing implied lines that connect the opposing corners. If I do that with the reference photo, that puts me kind of squarely in the middle of, there's this large thin shape here that's kind of largely placed in the center. Now I don't know if I have that shape correct, so I'm just roughing it in right now. And I can start to adjust that shape through the process of angle sighting. So I'll actually use this pencil here. I'm going to switch this over. And what I'm doing is on the reference image, I'm targeting this shape, closing one eye so that I flatten my depth perception, aligning this pencil with this shape on the reference photo, kind of locking my wrist, and I'm carrying it across, and I'm placing it, visualizing it directly on top of the screen that you're seeing. So I have this camera above me, it's projecting in front of me so I can see my drawing as though it's vertical. I'm just going to carry that across, and I'm going to get an average assessment of this angle here. Now, I'm not going to worry about getting the width correctly, because if I establish the width now and that becomes an anchor for my decisions, if I'm off by a slight amount, it might impact the spacing in these other vertical elements in this drawing, if that makes sense. All right, now, so what I'm going to do now that I have the page essentially divided with this one shape here, and it's hard to define. I'd see there's 1, 2, 3. It's kind of the fourth fold is here, the third fold. There's this shape in between, and that largely fits in the middle. That subdivides it, so now I know all of the folds that are to the left of that shape need to fit in this space. What I'm going to do is actually kind of subdivide that even further and find kind of the center of that and evaluate how that aligns with the reference image. So if this becomes kind of the center of this subdivision of the drawing, actually I can just kind of subdivide that even farther. And it's not super precise, but it gives me something. What I kind of observe is that there's this, in this big swoop here, it's really hard to describe this shape because it's a hanging piece of fabric. If it was a figure or something, I could say, oh, take this, the placement of the head or the arm or something. That I'd have to just kind of loosely describe what's happening. So hopefully this makes sense. But there's, we see this large U-shaped swoop, and there's multiple layers of folds, and there's a distinct shadow in here. And then between this shadow, there's another one here, and then another one kind of leading into this larger shape. So that's kind of what's happening in the back of my head. I haven't really measured those out, but I haven't also established the size or the width of these marks. I'm kind of roughly looking at the angles as the primary objective, finding the angles, the axes of these. And to kind of continue on the discussion of proportions and placement of these forms, getting the spacing right, that's also something that can be helpful to have in your mind prior to really kind of getting any farther with the drawing. At this stage, kind of define for yourself, what is your threshold for accuracy? How accurate do you need to be, and will you be content with? I'm just going to get this quick angle sight in here for that shape and right in there. And I shouldn't be using the tips of my fingers, but I am because I want to. It's as simple as that. But sometimes oily fingers make for bad effects on drawings, and so. But so far it seems to be playing nicely. So if I have any oily finger marks on the surface here that I need to contend with, I'll figure that out later. I'm going to fight through the drawing then. Okay. So in my mind now, I've divided the drawing into, oh darn it, I want to lose that tip there. I divided it in half vertically, divided this half into quarters, and then I'm visualizing now this top quadrant, and then this bottom quadrant, and so it's essentially I'm gridding the drawing, but I'm doing that in my mind. If I actually lay down a grid, it helps me to visualize that, but then that becomes an artificial structure that I'm going to have to contend with later, and I'm willing to sacrifice some precision for fluidity, if that makes sense. So I want this to really feel like folded fabric that's catching the light in beautiful ways. If I move a fold up or down slightly or make it a little bit wider or narrower, it's not going to necessarily affect that expression. It may not look exactly like the photograph, and this is why I think it's important for you to identify what your threshold is for that. What is really critical for this? If you want this to look exactly like the photograph, then you might be spending a little bit more time in these stages. If you want this to be more expressive, then you might kind of back off on trying to get those proportions correct and really just focus on fluid marks. And so any of those approaches is valid, and I think a towards, but it's helpful to have that established going in so that when you're making these decisions, you're doing so with clarity. Okay, so I'm kind of starting to refine, still using the Vine charcoal, some of these shapes. I use the kneaded eraser when I need to lift off some of these areas. And the goal for me in these early stages is to, again, to continue to think about these as abstractions. But I'm looking for that moment at which there's something that switches in my mind from this being just abstract marks on the surface to having a three-dimensional quality. So I'm not going to rush that by rendering anything too soon. I'm just going to keep building these shapes and correcting them until something clicks in my understanding of this subject, where now I start to see the folds on the surface. So. And then once I've got that, then I'll switch my brain over to thinking about this as fabric, and I can start to add more detail, more refinement. Now, one of the things that is going to be critical in this drawing is an understanding of the direction of the marks. And so I'm making a lot of these vertical marks, but as we go through the drawing, I'm going to be changing those up. I'm trying to be aware of how harsh those marks are. If they're really vertical marks, for you might think about switching the direction of your mark to run more horizontally like that, to make a more natural looking shape. So I'm just going to try to keep drawing while I look at the chat, see if there's anything here. Edie is saying, hi, can you explain the purpose of gesture drawing, please? I always feel like I'm wasting my time unless I'm trying to create a final image. Ooh, what a great question. I love that question. I have lots to say about that. In my mind, a drawing it's a refinement of the gesture. We're always gesture drawing to some degree. You know, what we're doing throughout the drawing, as you start to move into a greater degree of refinement, some of those gestures just get smaller and smaller and smaller. But in my mind, I'm trying to think that way because at the heart, the way I conceive of a gesture is related to the abstraction of the subject. And it's your kind of initial impression to it. You're going for it without layering on calculations that come later in the drawing. So there's going to be a lot of calculating that happens in the drawing, but for me, I have to kind of fight that a little bit and try to maintain a focus on the abstraction. So the view that I take about a gesture, it's about, I guess the easiest way I can describe it is the analogy that I use a lot, which is that of putting together a jigsaw puzzle. So it's a rare person who can grab a box, a jigsaw puzzle, reach in, grab a piece, look at it, and say, oh, this piece goes here on the table, never to be moved again, right? Pick up another piece and say, oh, that goes here, I'm going to put that there, and keep building until the image comes together. What I think a majority, at least what I do, and I think what a lot of people do, is you take a bunch of pieces, put them out there, and you start moving them around, right? So as you gather information about what's on each piece, that image starts to come together. You start to say, oh, this is kind of in this area. Oh, this might go together over here. But the image starts to form as you're gathering information about the individual pieces. With a gesture, that is essentially the initial dumping of pieces on the table. You're putting information down. Once you have information on the page, you can start to make specific decisions and start to calculate how they need to move. So you're going to be gathering information about the subject that you'll be applying to the drawing. As you gather more information, it'll make those decisions more clear. And so that's why I start to think of gesture as really the heart of the drawing, because it's not a clean transition from gesture to another stage to finishing, right? Where it's a gradient. We're kind of moving in and out. And sometimes I'll do this, take a paper towel here, wipe it down, and I'll do another gesture, right? And see if I can come at it with a deeper understanding, because there's so many benefits to gesture drawing. One big one is it allows you to see even if the drawing is going to fit on the page. It connects your hand and your mind and your body together. It gives you an initial glance at the subject. It allows you to assess what in its totality are you going to have to tackle in this drawing? Like, what's going to give you trouble? What might be a little bit easier? You're kind of stepping into the subject a little bit more gently when you're working with a gesture versus kind of going to the refinement. Now, the challenge for me was always of those finished marks, because it feels so good when you get those nice juicy details in there, right? And so for me, that would be the experience that I was chasing, and I would jump to that too early. Now the experience I'm chasing is really just sitting in the gesture land as long as possible, if that makes sense. I don't know if this is just muddied things for you, but it was a really good question. Let me know if you have any further questions, contradictory opinions. For me also, a lot of it is about what the gesture is doing to my mind. Because, especially coming into these drawings, I'm awfully often just thinking about something else. I've got other things going on at work and I'm totally distracted. I'm like, oh, I gotta be here now in drawing. And it's through the gesture where there's no real pressure to get things right that allows me to kind of enjoy the process and again, connect with the whole kind of environment of the drawing, the materials, the subject, my presence here, you all here. So let's see. Mary C. says, I love this as an exercise to practice shapes, tones, placement. It forces me to focus on abstract shapes because there is no figure or face. That's awesome. Mad Moments Go is talking about Leonardo's fabric drawings. I should check those out. Yeah. Of course, those are Amazing, yes. But thanks for bringing those up. I think it can be really healthy sometimes to have something like that running in the back of your mind. You know, I do that a lot with Sargent, you know, somebody like Rembrandt, Leonardo. In the back of my head, like, what would they do? And so creating master copies can be a way of helping to address that. And right now, I'm sticking in this gestures because my brain's not quite there yet for calculating. So I'm kind of delaying things, and I'm kind of reacting to this subject. Now, one of the things that I haven't talked about yet, but I'm doing a lot in this drawing, is the indirect gaze. The idea that I'm looking at the subject below me. That's where most of my attention is going, but in my periphery, I'm observing the drawing next to me and trying to just observe the direction of my marks and try to take both of them in at the same time. So letting my eyes lose focus, kind of almost focusing on either space in front or behind the screen. So you take them both in together and see what stands out. Oftentimes you can say, oh my gosh, there's a shape that's way too big or too distracting. It's too far left, too far right. And without calculating, you can start to create kind of decisions for yourself. All right, I'm gonna knock this down again as well. And I love what I'm doing here is unifying the drawing. All right, so every mark we make is a division on the page. The more division, the more contrast you have, the more exciting it becomes. But that comes at the expense of potentially fracturing the subject, making it harder for the viewer to understand how all those pieces fit together. So in my mind, by wiping this down, it softens everything and it unifies them into this one haze. So now it's one thing that we're looking at. Now we'll go back through and divide it farther. And I'm going to keep doing that throughout the drawing and see where it leads us. And so as I'm looking at the subject, it loosely looks like these shapes. Squinting and modulating my eyes. So squinting shuts down the amount of light that enters your eyes, eliminates details. Opening your eyes wide, flooding them with light, changes your perception of it, but it reduces the details as well. And then also just like kind of relaxing my eyes, relaxing the focus, and try to see there. Each mode of observation will give you slightly different information about the subject that you can then react to. So, hello, Troy. I'm glad you could join us. Nia is asking, is a 12B graphite pencil a good substitute for this vine charcoal portion of the drawing, or should I be using a harder pencil? Good question. I think, I don't know, I kind of like the idea of the softness of going for the 12B. It's going to be a much darker mark, and I think a lot of it will have to do with how it's reacting to the paper. So if you find that that softer, darker material is really grabbing the paper, you may end up fighting those values a little bit more. But if you find that it can float on the surface a little bit more like this vine charcoal does, then I would try that. Otherwise, use the lighter vine charcoal so that you can build up a haze. And try to do the same thing, just kind of wipe it down with a paper towel or a rag or chamois or something. Okay, what do I want to do now? Oh, mad moments go. Yeah, when I wipe down the drawing, it looks very effective and realistic. Yeah, it's funny how it does that. And a lot of that has to do with, I think, the direction of the marks. We're removing some of the directionality, and it does something in the mind that makes it accepted as a shadow shape. And so that's why kind of direction can be so important. That's the 3B. So I'm going to go to the HB pencil. So I'm using an overhand grip here. You can see how far back I'm holding it. Oh, I held it back a little bit too far. This just allows me to control the pressure. It's really the weight of the pencil that I'm working on. What you might find helpful is when we're dealing with these drapes and curves is to try to think of them as short, straight marks that kind of come together. So as I'm looking at this curve here, actually, I'll kind of erase, there's this kind of thin highlight on the fabric there. There's this kind of notch. And here, I'm just using the side of the pencil to build this value wash across the surface, and this can be achieved in graphite as well. There's a fabric drawing in the book as well. That was a lot of fun to do. Okay, so what I need to do is, so what I did is I just took an action. I started using this compressed charcoal, and I targeted a shadow shape. I put it down, and right away I can feel like it's out of place. All right, so I'm going to lead by feeling right now, try to move this shadow shape. Move that a little bit. And I think rather than use any comparative measuring, I'm going to kind of have a mental grid, playing out here. So I'm thinking about quadrants here. So I identified in the reference image, where the center is, where a horizontal center might be. And right now, I'm just kind of holding that in my mind to kind of identify certain landmarks relative to that. If you find it helpful, you could print out the reference image and actually place a grid on there. Now, the one thing I should also mention is you saw me wipe that down. You can see that it's not really releasing. That's as light as I can get now. Brighten that back up. And so I'm going to kind of strike from my consciousness the idea that any one area is going to have a bright white. Now I do have a white charcoal pencil, so if I do need to have a stronger highlight, I can try to pull that out using the white charcoal. But this is going to be slightly darker than the reference image. That's okay. I'll just have to key everything down. So we don't really talk about value keys a whole lot in this. But what we're doing is, the base values here are going to be a little bit lower, darker in the drawing than in the reference. And I think it's partly what's happening is I chose the back side of this paper. If I had flipped this over, it would be accepting the charcoal in a different way. But this is the smoother side, and I opted for the smooth qualities of the paper versus the ability to release the charcoal. Baibov is saying that I found really helpful with the idea of wiping it off and building it again using a charcoal, but I find it difficult doing the same with pencil. Yeah, so if you have graphite, it can be a little bit more challenging. If you have like a stick of graphite, like this right here, something like this, it can be a little bit easier to build up a layer of tone. Graphite powder can sometimes help. If you're using a pencil, though, then what you might end up having to do is build up lots of layers of light marks, a lot of cross-hatching in order to do that. It can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm kind of back to what I'm doing here. This is as light as I can get right in there, so that's good to know. I'm kind of shifting my thinking a little bit to really observing the light shapes versus the dark ones. And I'm starting with the vine charcoal. It's a little bit more gentle. In this way, it's similar to kind of observing negative shapes, negative space in a drawing. So we're working both additively and subtractively here. And as I'm doing that, I'm thinking both about the shape of the light and the shape of the dark and the spaces in between, trying to kind of fluctuate between those two modes of thinking. And one of the things that I'm also doing, you just saw me do that there, is before I make a mark now, I'm starting to think more about how it relates to other aspects of the drawing. My eyes are still blurred because I'm trying to take the whole thing in still. But as I'm erasing this mark, for example, I'm trying to make sure I understand where I am in the drawing. And this is where I think there was a comment earlier about it's easy to get lost in this. And the antidote to that is to try to force yourself to be stuck on the image as much as possible. And what I mean by that is that a common way of approaching a drawing, observational drawing, is to kind of glance at the subject, and we take an initial impression, initial understanding of the subject, take a mental snapshot, and then we end up creating the drawing, building the drawing from that mental snapshot. And that often that snapshot is a quick assessment. We understand that it's folded fabric, but our mind has processed a lot of information and has sent to our consciousness only what it needs to know, which is this folded fabric. And what we're doing through the drawing process is we're taking time to break down everything that our brain is processing to come to that conclusion. What are the shapes, what are the values, what are the edges that our brain is interpreting, and to come to the conclusion that this is folded fabric, right? And if we look at the subject and accept it as the folded fabric without taking time to really analyze the decisions that went into coming to that conclusion, then we get stuck in the drawing, and it's really easy to kind of lose sight of where we are, not to the subject. And so try to spend more time drawing indirectly. So again, keeping your eyes fixed on the subject, on the reference, while putting just a peripheral awareness on the drawing. So right now when I'm looking at the screen, I'm looking at the reference image, the one that's right below me that you're seeing. And then I'm looking down at the paper. And one of the things that's helped me in the past, and sometimes with a very complex subject where I feel like I might lose my place, I'll take this hand and I'll point to the reference image. And I'll say, I'm working on that point, that spot. And I'll leave it there. I'll draw, assess my drawing, come back to that point and say, no, that's the area I'm looking at. And if I move over, I can move things and move my hand over, and I remain fixed. And it just cognitively, it helps me to stay organized in my thinking a little bit. So just again, reacting to some of the lighter shapes, doing a quick analysis of how it's forming the negative shapes, the darker shapes. So this is just a bit of a subtractive process. Edie is saying, would a blending stump work as well as wiping or hatching? Yeah, I think so. I tend to love my blending stump. I'm going to bring that in more towards kind of finishing stages. You can see how it blends pretty well. Sometimes what I found is that it can kind of embed the charcoal into the paper a little bit, and if I'm not quite ready for that, it could cause some trouble. Yeah, this is really holding the charcoal, so it's not releasing to this bright white. What I did, I don't think I grabbed the right paper. I think I grabbed some other paper and I'm using the wrong side of it. So I don't think this is the Rives BFK because it wouldn't be doing that. It's very different than what we see here in this preparatory drawing where I can really lift off and it's not a problem. So yeah, I grabbed some other paper. That's my bad, I was in a rush. So that's what we do, we roll with it, right? This is going to give us an opportunity to, I don't know, understand surface and values more deeply now. So, darn it! And here's what you see what I've done to my eraser. I was kind of using the wrong side of it. What I should have been doing is just using the same flat side, so I maintain the sharp point when I need it, but I'll have to sharpen it a little bit later. Okay. I'm going to do a quick assessment of some of these other folds here. Now, in terms of trying to get a straight line or straight-ish line, because it's not a vertical edge, there's a slight angle to it, so I'm trying to assess the angle. I try to draw from the shoulder as much as possible, kind of locking the wrist, drawing from the shoulder. And then in smaller areas, you could start to engage the wrist a little bit more. So just kind of focusing a little bit more. And I'm kind of being tentative with some of these eraser marks before I bear down, just to try to see how it's all looking. Now, one of the things that we're going to get into later, especially as we start to finish the drawing, is really what's happening at the edges. So right now, again, my eyes are blurred, looking at these as abstract shapes. But as we start to really observe kind of the finer elements of this, we're going to look at how we can use the direction of our marks to really enforce the structure of these folds, to tuck some underneath, bring some folds on top. We'll look at value relationships as well. So we'll look at some of the reflections, the reflected light, the highlights. Making a lot of eraser bits here. Okay. Okay, let's see. Oh, yeah, pick up a stick of charcoal. What I'm really excited to kind of work with more is this is the General's pack. So they sent me out some of the Primo pencils, and those are awesome. So that's what I've been using. But this is for the next one. So it comes with a variety of materials here. So it's pretty awesome. I'm digging them. They sent out this black Factus eraser as well. All right, but so this is as light as it can go. I'm going to brighten that up a little bit, and that's a little bit more accurate. Okay. All right, let's see. And now with kind of talk about the eraser, a big component, like I said, is the paper. And it's often overlooked in drawing, or we don't sometimes give it enough of an emphasis. The paper itself is really half of the drawing. And so, it's easy to do what I did, as I grabbed a paper. I made an assumption that it was the Rives BFK, but it's not. And so it's easy to kind of just grab the paper and go. And then if it doesn't work out, get kind of frustrated with ourselves, when it's really just a matter of finding the paper that is most receptive to your way of working, as well as the material you're using. All right, So I'm kind of fairly happy with these ghostly images, these ghostly shapes that are forming on the page. So now I'm going to kind of refine them a little bit. And one of the things I need to be mindful of is the edges that need to be harder and the edges that are going to be softer. So if I'm looking at this fold in here, for example, it's a little bit softer on this side of the shape than it is on this side. So I'm trying to be mindful of that, right? And kind of as I move towards the softer edge, just laying the pencil down a little bit more to lift the tip off the page. As I move towards the sharper edge, I can tilt it upward and engage the tip a bit more. Now, one of the other things that is really kind of fascinating is for some reason, this shape is becoming a bit of a focal point for me. I'm going to give it a little bit more character and observe the specific shape there. I think I had just kind of averaged it out a little bit too much. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to refine these shapes as a whole, but I'm not going to be looking at really getting these values correct at this point. I'm kind of creating an average value. And then once we kind of get all of these shapes established, we'll go back into these shadow shapes and add more variety and adjust the edges here. So what I'm thinking about right now is really just building up these shadow shapes, trying to think logically from one shape to the other. And again, also kind of trying to be somewhat aware of edges that are softer and edges that are going to be harder. So on this shadow shape, for example, the harder edge is right here, softer edge is there. And what that's correlating to, what that's going to lead to is a deeper understanding of shadow shapes and shadow structure. And we'll talk about that later in the drawing as well. So if you're not really familiar with that term, you hear me say shadow shapes, it might be confusing. And so let me kind of describe what that is. So every object that's being struck by light will have a light side and a shadow side. So that the shadow that's on the object, that's the side that's turned away from the light, is what's called the form shadow. That object will often cast a shadow on the surface, so that's called the cast shadow. So you have the form shadow, and you have the cast shadow. And those together form what's called a shadow shape. Now, when we're looking at these folds, we're kind of looking at both of them at the same time. So if in this fold, for example, this is the form shadow here. There's this bump right here. It catches the light. It falls into shadow here, so that's a form shadow. But this ridge is also casting a shadow on this edge. So that cast shadow is creating a sharper edge than the form shadow. Along in here where we transition from light into shadow, there's a bit of a soft transition there, a bit of a gradient. And it's really critical to pay attention to those edges, because that's what's going to create the convincing understanding of the structure that's being created and illuminated by the light. Now, you don't necessarily have to remember all the terms of form shadow, cast shadow, and shadow shape. If you stay focused on edges and trust those observations, that it will play out on your drawing. And so you want to, you want to kind of have an understanding for yourself, like what information is useful and helpful. And if it just kind of bogs down your process to think about technical terms, then go back to what you can rely on. Just think about them as abstract shapes, and what observations can you make about those shapes, in particular those edges. So I think it can be helpful to understand how light and shadow function together, but even without that understanding, if you simply maintain a focus on edges, you can often arrive at a really good place in terms of capturing that sense of light. So You know, we all process information in different ways. And so sometimes there's information that just is too much, right? And it kind of bogs down, overrides like some of the basic, you know, the basic observations that we're making. So this shadow here, this form shadow on this fold right in here, has very soft edges. So when I address that, I'm just thinking about these soft circular marks. And in general, I'm putting more emphasis on the center of the shape, working my way out to the edges, rather than outlining a shape or you know, creating some sort of contour line there and then filling it in. And so you might find it helpful to think about it in that way, is kind of working up towards an edge from the center of that shadow shape, rather than from the outside in, which is a very common way to approach building up shadow shapes or building up shapes. So I'm kind of describing this edge here, but I'm trying to keep it light because I don't want a hard line to appear. I just need a way to visualize that edge. Now we're going to talk about directionality of mark at some point as well, but if you're, I think if anything, if you're not sure what direction to make a mark, make circular marks and see what that does. They're omnidirectional. But what I'm thinking about when I'm talking about marks is the cross-contour information. It's the information that we're, the direction of the marks kind of helps to reinforce the structure of the forms that we're looking at. All right. Ooh, Nellart is saying cast shadow. I'm confused. Yeah. So it is a little confusing here, but this is a good shadow shape to observe. So if you're looking at the reference image in this side here, of course we see it rise up, it strikes a light, comes down the other side where it's a form shadow. This side is in shadow. But because of this ridge, it's like a valley across here. The light's coming in from here, it's striking this, it's casting a shadow on this side. So then this other fold, like the other side of the valley, is appearing, and there's just this thin sliver of shadow on this side here that is actually being cast onto that ridge. So that's really what we're observing. And we can't really see that in the drawing yet, because what I've done is I've averaged the values as one shape. And then once I get in there and we start to modulate it a little bit more, then it'll really pull these forms into a kind of a deeper understanding. Hopefully that makes sense. Did that help address your question, I hope? If not, let me know. But at this stage, I'm still trying to think largely abstractly. So what is the shape? What is the direction? Is there anything about the edges that I can glean? This shadow down here, for example, a little bit sharper edges on this side, a little bit softer as we move up. Starting with just a light pressure on the pencil, gradually building it. Now this one's a good one. This bend right in here, this fold, there's a strong reflected light catching right in here, so it's difficult to see that shadow shape. I need to drop that down a little bit more. Now this here, we see a replication of what we saw over here. This is a peak right here where light is catching on this side, transitioning into shadow, into the form shadow. So we see a soft gradient from the light to the form shadow. And then it's casting a shadow on the adjacent ridge. And that cast shadow has a sharper edge. So we'll kind of just soften the edge on this side, sharpen the edge on the right side here. I'm going to average that out. I'm not going to look at any sort of bounce light or darker shadows. I'm just refining those shapes. Yes, Jazz W made it a perfect observation. That last shadow has a darker shadow shape inside it. Yeah, so we see that in here. There are these darker areas. We see that in here. There's a darker area in here. But I'm going to wait to do that until I've built up all of the shadow shapes in case there's adjustments that I need to continue to make. So I'm going to try to build up the whole drawing at once. Now that's largely the that's just a decision I made right now. So I could have totally approached it differently and it would have been just fine. So I could really be sticking with finishing off these shadows now. But for a reason that I don't think I can fully articulate, I'm deciding to do it this way. So that just goes to say that it's, if you're so inclined to kind of stick with some of those nuanced areas within those shadows, that's perfectly fine as well. Especially if you're confident in the placement of those. Now, one of the advantages to this, we saw this in the last week's drawing of Michelangelo's David, is really looking at the relationship between convex and concave marks, because that gives us information about which object is in front of which. And so if I'm looking at this fold, for example, this is on top of this shadow here. So one way that you might tackle that is, as I'm drawing this shadow shape here, letting it run long, and then use my eraser to lift off that shape on top of it to create that clean overlap. And that can sometimes help to reinforce the structure. And it kind of goes, again, to the concept of really just studying the edges. Is it a soft edge or is it a sharp edge? Because what can happen is if we don't really pay attention to those subtle areas, this shape right here can advance. It'll feel like a line that's sitting on top of the form rather than a shadow that's cutting into it with this lighter edge on top. So, Susan P. Faust, cast shadow of a sphere, shadow cast on the ground by the sphere itself. Yes, exactly. Right now, again, I'm looking at the shadow shapes, trying to kind of take note of what's a cast shadow and what's not. So here, for example, we've got a really interesting situation. We see that this kind of plateau, it wraps around into this shadow shape under here. This is largely a cast shadow. There's just a thin form shadow here. So there's a kind of a soft edge along the left side where it wraps around here. But for the most part, what we're looking at is a cast shadow that has that sharper edge. But we see a fall off here where there's a bend and it starts to get more diffused down in here. Again, just doing these small circular marks so that I don't have too much directionality applied to the marks I'm making now. And so what I'm thinking about in terms of blocking in these shadow shapes now, and then coming back to refine the shadows further, I'm doing that to establish, two main aspects of this drawing. There's light side, and then a shadow side. And I want to make sure that any of the bounced light, the reflected light that I'm observing in the shadow side, doesn't get confused for the highlights. And especially in the situation I have now, because I'm using the wrong side of the paper, it's not giving me that bright white. It's going to be really easy for me to confuse some of the bounce light, like we're seeing on the inside of this shadow. If I make that bounce light too strong, it's going to be really easy to confuse with a highlight, and then it's going to throw off the structure altogether. I'm trying to create that hierarchy. I'm trying to create that clear division between light and then shadow. Once you're in the shadow, then you find all those subtle variations, but you're controlling the value ranges so that there's clarity and there's consistent structure throughout the drawing. Now, I want to start to be thinking about the direction of my marks. So we have, of course, a lot of these vertical lines. If my marks running this way become dominant, what that does is it confuses things for the viewer. The viewer looks at that and says, well, these marks are running in this direction, this fold is running in this direction. Because they're running in the same direction, they must belong together. What I want is I want the brain to separate shapes, separate parts of the form. They're moving in different directions. I'm trying to create more division. So I can achieve that by just turning my marks horizontally to contrast that vertical edge. And then, looking at these softer edges along here, I can kind of massage that a little bit with my charcoal. But if I switch to this direction, it runs contrary to that vertical edge, and that's going to create a subtle understanding of the structural relationship between those two. And so hopefully you can kind of create some of that division more effectively. So now we're back. I'm moving just from one to the next to the next. I'm again observing sharper edges on the right side of the shadow shape, softer edges on the left. And so when I'm working on this side over here, I'm just really lifting off. I'm barely touching that surface. I'm looking at, there's a bend in these shadows, and I want to make sure that they're consistent from one to the next. Because it's so easy at this stage to get locked in on one specific shape and lose sight of how it relates to other things in the drawing. So you can see me working directly on top of the highlight that I had before. So I've moved this over slightly. And now what I'm doing is I think I've somehow enhanced this shadow, perhaps too much, maybe it's too large. I'm going to see how it feels. Remember that you're in kind of control of the accuracy and what that threshold is. And I think there's a lot of there's a lot to the argument that this is you can use the reference image really just as a jumping off point. It's all about what serves the drawing the most, what would serve the composition, the design aspect of it, the understanding of light and shadow, those types of things. And then maybe deviating from the reference photo a little bit to suit a stronger composition. But you could also, if you're so inclined, and the drawing process for you is more satisfying when it looks more like the reference photo. If it's much more of a photographic reproduction, then go for that too. So, okay. So this is all just you can see I'm holding it at the very back of the pencil here, so that it kind of promotes just that, again, that lighter touch and reduces the directionality of the marks to some degree. Yeah, I'm really using a lot of the eraser in this one. Have to pull out the vacuum after this one, clean up the floor here because I've got eraser shavings all over the place now. All right. To orient myself a little bit, got a little bit lost, so taking some time to just regroup, make sure I know which fold I'm working on. All right. Well, welcome back, Tammy. I'm glad that you're finding this helpful. Starting to focus a little bit. I can feel that shift in my mind. I was wicked scattered earlier. So as um, I kind of initiated the drawing. I was all over the place in my mind. But now I'm starting to become more focused, and I can feel that shift in the brain that I enjoy that so much. Changing the direction of my marks down here to, again, promote the division between these folds, more of that separation. Softening the left side, so we're seeing this consistent structure of a softer edge to the left side of these shadow shapes, a sharper edge to the right, and it's either being overlapped by a fold or a cast shadow. And so when you can see I'm quickly building up this area here. But within each mark, there's kind of a rough awareness of where I'm putting the pressure, in each stroke. So I'm intentionally lifting a little bit more on this side to create a softer edge. I don't think it's really easy to show on camera. And I'm going to move into this one over here. Ooh, this one's a really soft edge right on here. I'm really liking the surface, actually. Like I said, I think I used the wrong side of it, so it was really holding the charcoal. But I like the way it feels, too, at the same time. There was a time in my, for a long time, actually, when I'd really beat myself up. And I'm curious how you all feel about that. But I would just have, I kind of undefined yet powerful expectations for the drawing experience. And I would just, I'd start struggling with a drawing. And then I had so much of my identity wrapped up into creating good drawings that when one would go bad, I would feel like there's something wrong with me. And all that self-doubt would start creeping in. And luckily, that's gone for the moment. But, I still get into that mode sometimes. But I guess I've started to really kind of enjoy fighting through a drawing. We talked about that last time. And, what that means is that, like, you kind of open yourself up to kind of experimenting a little bit with the materials and trying new processes, putting things out there, see what it teaches you about the drawing process, about who you are as an artist, see if it unlocks some sort of new technique or new observation. But sometimes you feel like, just like this, I can't erase down to the white, so I don't really have much of an option there. I could have just started over, I suppose, or I power through and see, well, what can I do with this limitation? What can I extract from this experience that's going to be useful? And that's something, a mindset that I wish I could apply to other areas of my life. But it seems to work in my drawing process. That's how it's playing out. Taking the paper towel, it's going to be, I'm wiping it down, but I'm going to try to be a little bit more scrutinizing. I really like what this surface is doing with the materials. It's blending so much more smoothly than what was happening in the preparatory version. So I'm still thinking about direction of marks, even with this large tool here, the paper towel. All right. All right, Wilma. Yeah, hard to know that sometimes even a professional artist gets lost. I totally do. That's awesome. Let's see. Yes, Nia is saying happy accidents, not mistakes. That's true. Well, it's just I view them as opportunities, right? And certainly I've made a lot of bad drawings, a lot of bad paintings, and what is a bit of a relief right now is that after 20 plus years of trying to do this, I'm at a point where I've taken off some of the pressure to try to have each one be a hit. But it's taken me a long time to get there. Like I said, for me, my identity was starting to get wrapped up in that. And so it took some reframing on my part to try to figure out who am I as an artist if 90% of my drawings have significant room for improvement. What does that mean? Because the thing is, there's a million artists out there. Everybody's got there's a lot of really very talented, skilled artists with so many different approaches. Greg is saying, this show has helped me to take some of the pressure off and enjoy drawing more. That's awesome. Haven't been able to shake how hard I am on myself when it goes bad. I hear ya. Welcome, Gail. Glad you could join us. If you are new, what you're watching is Drawing Together with Artist Network. My name's Scott Maier. We do this every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. We draw together because it's more fun to do it with friends. And I think really as artists, we struggle through a lot of things, and often we don't show that struggle. It's part of the growth process is to challenge ourselves. And so this is all about that challenge. It's about the practice, not the perfection of it all. Yeah, that's really not lifting. All right, so I've just got this is about as light as it can go in some areas. Now I'm curious, if I bring in the white charcoal, it kind of blends a little bit, but that pops a bit. Okay, so I know I can pull that out a little bit later if I need to. I'm not going to do that much now. I'm going to set that aside. Lindy is asking what the brand of the eraser is. This is a Derwent retractable eraser, which I love. This thing is awesome. I have been enjoying these Factus erasers. They're really good as well. All right, shadow shape time. Oh, I want to do that. No, I want to do, what is this one? This is the B, so a little bit darker, a little bit softer. All right, I'm going to modulate these forms a little bit. Now this is where I really want to start thinking about the direction of my mark. So thinking about the structure, the planes of these folds a little bit. Starting to observe, again, the relationship between some of these folds, some of them advancing, some of these shadow areas cutting behind some of those, and how can we use the direction of the marks to reinforce that? And I talked a bit about that in a couple episodes ago. As I kind of reflect on trying to simplify the drawing process down into a few key things to focus on. Like if you could say, like, I could only have 3 or 4 criteria by which I choose to met my marks, what would those criteria be? Shape and direction are really kind of coming out for me as big elements. So the direction of the marks, and what is that shape? And then sometimes it's a feeling. I just need to, it feels like it goes this way, so I'm going to make marks that go that way. And sometimes you just kind of have to observe how it's playing out on the page. So as I'm making these marks here, for example, they're not leaving much. I have such a light touch to these marks right now that they're not leaving a whole lot. So I don't have to worry too much about the direction of my marks. But if I was being heavy, more heavily handed, that could be an issue. So I can use my blending stump at this point as well. And if when I'm not quite sure what direction I want to make these marks here, so I'll use a circular one. And because this cuts behind that, I'm not going to be too delicate around at that edge. I'm going to let some of those marks run long, and I can always use an eraser to cut that back out. So if you're one of the risks that I run when trying to be too precious at an edge is creating halos, and that often flattens the drawing when there's not kind of a clean edge. So this is a well-used blending stump loaded with charcoal, so I can use that to make some of these marks and kind of modulate some of these forms in here. What am I looking at? I'm still using the small reference rather than the large one that's to my left. Now this edge in here is actually a sharper edge, so I'm going to use some negative drawing to sharpen up that edge, or some tractive drawing, I mean. Try to modulate that form a bit. How's everybody doing? How are the drawings coming? Anybody stuck? Okay, so as I look at this, now we're going to start to break apart these shadow shapes to try to find areas of lighter or darker. Now I'm going to look for the darker shapes first, and then evaluate the lighter areas, because it's going to change the relationship in the values, and it's going to change your understanding of the values. So this shape right here that is relatively dark, as I add a shape that's even darker, it will change my impression of that original value. And so what I'm looking at now is that I can isolate this one area, and that becomes kind of its own drawing, right? Now I've established the overall context for everything, so I know that shape is going to generally fit, and I can just focus on this one little area as though it were its own kind of self-contained drawing of light and dark. And so what you see is like this darker shape on the right with that sharper edge. A lighter shape here with a softer edge. Now within this little stretch here, it's a little bit lighter and a little bit darker right around along that ridge. So what I'm going to do along this ridge is I'm going to do these small circular marks and just use the blending stump right now. It's a little bit more gentle, so I can create a little bit of variation along that edge. But it's not that sharp line. And you see that extend down here along that ridge where the turn from the light side into the shadow side of that fold is. It's a little bit darker. So I'm going to lay that in that darker value and then smooth it out with a blending stump. And then now this value here in the middle, that lighter value there, that's now it's expressing some of that bounce light. That was the original shadow shape. We've just darkened everything else around it. Now that appears to be lighter. Nia is asking, how do I sharpen the erasers? I do use a razor blade for that. Let's see, I'll do it right now actually. Let me sharpen it. Just got to be careful not to cut your fingers. I'm going to cut my finger. So I'm just cutting it like that. Now I have this wasted chunk right here, but have a nice sharp edge. Yeah, check out this Derwent retractable eraser. I love it. I think I got mine at Jerry's in town. All right, so now I'm going to look at this shadow shape here. Now, where we see the darkest areas is right in here at the deepest part of this valley, and it's a little bit more on the cast shadow side. And I'm using an overhand grip intentionally because that's going to prioritize the shape over line. I don't want to create a line that I then fill in, because then what that does is it kind of creates a distinct form, a distinct shape that we then have to contend with. We have to then build onto the structure. By starting by observing the shapes, you're building everything as a form, and it holds together a little bit easier. So a little bit darker, like right under here. And then right along this ridge, again, we see a soft edge, but it's a little bit darker at that turn. It's called the line of termination, is what that is. It's where on as a form shadow is formed, it's the edge between the light side and the shadow side. And it's often a very soft gradient, depending on the nature of the object. But if it's rounded, it'll be a soft edge generally. It's called that line of termination. And I'm going to soften that a little bit here using that the blending stump. And I'm going to try to map out this curve to the shape here. Let's see. Oh, Khalid is asking, is that hatching? Yeah, there is some hatching. So to talk about just kind of terms, when we're shading, and I'll pull this out. So if you're shading, if you're building up parallel marks, that's called hatching, right? You turn and you layer over another swash of marks, that's called cross-hatching, and you can build up numerous layers all at different directions. When you're thinking about hatching, especially for something like this, if your marks are visible, then you might think about them in a dimensional way. I refer to those as dimensional hatching. So if you have like a ridge, then maybe on the back side of the ridge you're kind of curving like this, and you're kind of reinforcing the form, versus parallel hatching, where if you have a form, you might build up that shadow shape all through parallel marks, if that makes sense. I do kind of a combination of all of that, so it's not very clear when I do it, but those are kind of happening there. So now let's see, this is a really interesting shape right here. So I'm looking at that ridge along this kind of sharp bend, a little bit darker down in here. And then, so we have light side, shadow side. There's some bounce light right in here, and then the cast shadow. So that cast shadow is a little bit darker, and it's got that sharper edge. So I'll start to drop that in. And this is why it can be helpful to work with something like fabric, because, like I said, this can apply to so many other subjects, primarily other figurative work, whether it's a figure that's draped in cloth, or whether you're drawing a feature like an ear or something that has these complex folds. Tackling something like fabric can give you some increased confidence to tackle some figurative work. see what's happening in here. And again, I'm working with the small thumbnail rather than the full-size image, and I don't know why, but I don't want to go to the big one. I like trying to figure out this small one. I wish I had a reason beyond I just felt like it, but that's the truth. That's what so much of the drawing is. That's why there can be millions of people drawing, and we each find our own way through it. All right, so now you can see in this fold some added dimension to it now, again, with that cast shadow being a little bit darker. This area here that was the dark shadow now is a little bit lighter. That expresses the reflected light. And let's see, I can, as I move up here, just need to soften those edges a little bit. So just trying to be delicate with the blending stump to soften that edge. So this is really what we're going to be doing for, for a little while now, is more of the same. I don't know why I did that. I should have been doing it this way. So as I'm darkening this part of that shadow artificially, that's not happening in the reference image, but I'm trying to get this edge to pop a little bit more. So what I'm doing is I'm kind of artificially bringing this shadow shape down. But what I should have been doing is running these in a different direction other than parallel to the slope of that. All right, so now go. I'm going to do the same in here. Now looking for the cast shadow shape, the bounce light, and I'm not lifting any of that reflected light. What was really a struggle for me for a long time is that I would observe the light, and the tendency was to overstate it. And I would make it too strong, and then it would compete with the highlight and flatten out the whole drawing. And so I'm really trying to fight that urge right now and add darks before I start lifting anything. I may still go back in and lift some of the bounce light in that area, but I'm going to wait until I've created more variety on this page here. So as I'm laying down this line of termination along this fold here, intentionally using the side of the pencil so that it has a softer edge, and then just kind of blending, just trying to soften that edge as much as possible. And then I come over here, we come down this side, we get some bounce light into the valley here where we have more of that cast shadow, and it's a little bit sharper. Trying to let the charcoal do the work. If you're working with graphite, you might be switching to some of the softer graphites. If you have something like a 8B or 10B, 12B, I love those softer ones. Let's see. Okay. Whew. Anima Sola, I'm now inspired to get back to my paper and charcoal. Awesome. That's the best thing to hear. I just feel like everybody can benefit from drawing as much as possible. So thank you, Wilma, for comments, and Gail. And Gail is saying, I find it easy to get lost in the folds because I lose focus. This will be a good one to try out. Saving this my playlist for sure. Oh, awesome. That's good to know. Yeah, hopefully, yeah. Like I was kind of surprised after I did the preparatory version of this drawing that it was so much harder. And I'm like, oh, this one just looks like I should be able to do it. And then as soon as I started working on it, I'm like, what was I thinking that I thought this would be easier than some of the other ones we've been working on? But yeah, it is so easy to get lost because we're really good at, our brains are really good at kind of taking in things as a whole. It's the whole forest for the trees situation. And in most of our lives, it's not really necessary or helpful to count each and every fold and understand the spacing between them. What's most useful is that we know that this is fabric and what we can do with the fabric, and have some sort of emotional connection to it. And so we're not used to doing the conscious work of understanding the spacing here. So I'm just doing some of these circular marks here to get rid of some of the directionality. So this is a tricky one here because we have this fold. We have light transitioning into the line of termination, which comes right up along the edge, and then it really folds back in underneath. And what that does is it creates a sharp edge here in the shadow where there's a little bit of that thin sliver of reflected light. When you squint your eyes, that whole thing disappears. And so that's one of the good tests to apply to a drawing where value is an important aspect, is to squint at the subject. If an edge disappears, then you realize that those values are closer together than they might appear when you're looking at it in sharp focus. Because when we look under sharp focus, it's that part of our retina, that part of our brain that's engaged is designed to see those edges and textures and details at the expense of an accurate understanding of the value relationships. And so we tend to, when we focus on a small area like this, we might see that bounce light and overstate it, right? And this is where I want to be really delicate. I think I'm going to start up here at the top, and I'm working on the cast shadow side of this. There's a bit of a darker area here. There's kind of folds within that. And I'm going to kind of start in the center of this cast shadow, and then as I work my way up to the sharper edge on the left, kind of roll my wrist a little bit to engage the tip a bit more, then lay it back down. And as I encounter this edge here where that's a little bit sharper, again, engage the tip a little bit more to create that sharper edge. And I'm just looking to make sure I'm running kind of playing a dangerous game right now. So these marks that I'm making are largely vertical. And we talked about the direction of the marks earlier, and about the dangers and not paying attention to that. Now what I'm observing on the page is that I'm not really seeing a lot of directionality. So I'm going to keep going because it's just a more comfortable mark for me. But if I was really noticing vertical marks, I would have to probably rotate the paper and really try to get horizontal marks running this direction. So if you're looking at your drawing and you're seeing strong directionality and it's running vertically, you might consider changing that up a little bit. And the blending stump helps to smooth things out. But now you can see this reflected light here is starting to become visible. Now it's much wider than what we're seeing in the reference photo. So I could start to close that gap in a little bit. Now this is an aspect of the drawing that becomes really important in really expressing the structure of these folds, is to look at some of these really subtle areas. And so take your time with this stuff right now. And if you're in a similar place in your own drawing, really take some time to massage that edge a bit. And I'm just going to keep coming down this edge. And I start more from the center of the form. Creating this kind of fuzzy edge mark right now. Coming back in. I just want to make sure that I'm not creating a line along that edge. If I create a dark line, that's going to really flatten out the drawing. Now here we see a sharp edge because of the overlapping form. We see a sharp edge up here because of the edge of the nature of the cast shadow. Down here it's a different sharp edge. And that's what's going to help to create the structure, is if we look at the direction of the marks, we understand what's happening in the edges. I had to kind of contort myself a little bit. This is just coming into a little bit focus now, so it's a little bit harder for me to talk. And use circular marks. Those vertical marks are dangerous. So now we have just kind of a rough structure where we have light side, line of termination, where it gets a little bit darker, and then some of that bounce light along that sharp edge. And if we need to, actually I'm going to use this. If you need to sharpen up that edge a little bit farther, you can take like the sharp edge of the eraser, and I'm just kind of placing it along that edge. But I'm not scrubbing the paper, I'm just kind of placing and lifting. You know, this little vibration just helps to grab a little bit more. So hopefully what that does is it sharpens that edge without it, again, competing with the highlights. Whew, okay. Khalid is saying, I'm looking for advice to manage different edges and not losing it. I admire the beauty, fine art you're doing. Oh, thank you so much. Hopefully this is helping with some of those edges. It is such an important aspect of realism. You know, not all drawing necessarily, but so hopefully this is helpful in some way. But yeah, it can make such a difference. You know, there's just a long time when I was in my own work where that wasn't a significant focus of mine, and it really held me back. And so when I started to really shift my thinking into observing edges, then it was one of those plateaus that I got over. So, all right, I'm gonna try to move through this drawing a little bit more quickly. Somebody said they saw a face in here. I didn't get a chance to really read that. I see a face on the left. That's awesome. Can't remember what that neurological process is that in which we see faces and things. I know it's a very kind of primal part of our brain. It's something that we're born with, so that where we recognize patterns of light and dark, so that when we're born, we can look at a human and recognize it. So we're all born with that, and that part of the brain remains active, and which kind of is what is behind our ability to see faces and clouds and trees and all sorts of things. It's pretty awesome stuff. All right, so here we go again. We've got another, we're just kind of repeating so many of the same ideas, kind of starting with that line of termination. I'm kind of overstating it right now, but trying to keep it really soft. And trying to make sure that there's no real directionality to the marks as much. So you see it as this thin vertical shape, but you're not necessarily seeing it as a directional mark or a line. So we have the form shadow, line of termination, some bounce light in there, and then a bit of the cast shadow. Again, kind of sharper edges on the right. This one gets a little bit more diffused down the bottom. Sorry, just requiring a little bit more focus right now. So I don't know, what do you guys want to talk about? This and now I'm noticing, you know, this pattern in the whole process. So it does require a little bit less thinking. I think I could probably chat a bit more, but I don't know if I'm really doing anything that's fundamentally different. If you are joining us, again, what you're watching is Drawing Together with Artist Network. My name's Scott Maier. My new book is out for pre-order if anybody's interested. I pinned that at the top of the chat, so it's on Amazon, it's on Barnes & Noble. It's called See, Think, Draw, and is built on a lot of the concepts that we cover here. Really, doing this show, I have a lot of thanks to you all as an audience for helping me, joining me through Drawing Together, because it helped me to refine some of the curriculum that's been kind of swirling around in my head for a long time. And but it's all about, the book is all about giving ourselves challenges, learning through specifically chosen subjects, learning how to break down subjects in a strategic way, and learn certain techniques and concepts through those specifically designed projects. So. Actually, these right here, creating these vertical stripes, and I'm not really feeling the sense of structure that I would like. So let me turn the direction of the marks a little bit more here. And so I'm going to run this line of termination, these marks here, horizontally to really kind of express this direction of the fold. Rather, I think those vertical marks were too strong. And it's amazing what just a subtle change in the direction of the marks can do to understanding the form. Let's see. Okay. Shadow shape is pretty rough on that side, so then I'm going to cut this with this other fold that cuts in right on top. So hopefully what I'm showing is, again, my general process for building up the drawing kind of as a whole. So bringing the image into clarity, and we talked about that in the past episodes, is that when we think about the word draw, we use it in ways other than making images, right? You know, we draw names from a hat or water from a well, things like that. We're allowing the drawing to emerge as though it's being pulled out on the page. And so it's all kind of coming up together, and in that way, my hope is to create something that's unified. If I had divided it, what is challenging for me in doing that, you know, kind of creating a lines, you know, a linear segmentation of the subject and then filling in the values. When I've done that in the past, what has happened is that it leads to this fractured drawing. I'm always contending with all those divisions created from the initial line work. And so that's what is at the heart of this process here. It's nothing, you know, particularly revolutionary. A lot of artists that draw this way, but I kind of had to experience that for myself. I was, you know, taught a variety of different approaches, ways of conceiving drawing, and I kind of circled back around to this way of thinking after, you know, after failing in so many other ways and seeing the benefit of this. this process or this mindset about drawing, about building from the gesture. So right in here, with this fold, we see a kind of a smaller cast shadow, but it's dark. And that helps to provide a little bit of structure there. And then it kind of gets diffused here. Overwhelmed by the idea of these certain terms of, light side, form shadow, shadow shapes, all of that stuff. Again, try to fall back on the abstraction of it all. You can make a convincing drawing without having really any understanding of the subject you're working with. Having a more in-depth kind of anatomical understanding of your subject can be valuable in appreciating the subject, but I've worked with some students in the past where I might hear, well, I just don't know how to draw that subject. And I think one of the things I'm trying to convey is that drawing is a mindset, it's a process. There are decisions that we make, and you can apply those decisions to any subject. So the way I'm drawing fabric, maybe the same way I draw a portrait or a landscape, right? In that we're making very similar decisions, but sometimes it can be overwhelming. There's so many decisions we can make, so that's why I keep trying to distill it down into really core decisions. And I think understanding the shapes in an abstract way gets you a very long way in creating a drawing that you can be satisfied with, that expresses the truth of an object you might be observing. So I think I just wanted to kind of put that out there in case that's something that some of you might be struggling with, is that the idea that you might fundamentally draw fabric differently than you might draw, say, a cat or a portrait, or like I said, a landscape or something. So at least that's the way I think about it. So drawing, there's so many different approaches, and you'll certainly find evidence of drawing approaches that will say, here's how to draw a cat, or how to draw folded fabric. You do these steps and you end up with a drawing. And I think there can be a lot of value in studying that. What I'm trying to identify is what is the way I conceive of it, and see if it's of any value to you all. And I think it's worth trying as many different approaches as possible to see what you learn from them. All right, so I'm just going to, with the blending stump, kind of roughen some of these other shadow shapes here. Let me see, let me adjust the exposure, brighten that up a little bit more. There we go. Well, I do have my white charcoal. And I'm going to see what I can use this for. So like I said, I've lifted off as much of the charcoal as I can. I don't think I can get much out of any of these highlights here. So let me see what happens, like right in here, where I see a stronger highlight. That's starting to really lift. And I'm going to be a little sparing with it. You can use it to kind of blend as well. And I think what I want to do now is consider kind of focal point and flow throughout the drawing. And there's something about this side that I feel like it's just a more complex form. There's a kind of a tighter concentration of the folds and a stronger contrast between light and dark. So it feels like a natural place for a highlight, and I'm going to do that. I'm going to start to locate some of these highlights here. Now, one of the things to look at with the highlights is that they tend to happen at the curves. So here there's a bit of a valley and the light is catching inside there and is a little bit stronger. And then also the peaks of some of those ridges, it catches a little bit more. And that can be helpful when learning, figure drawing, for example. Looking for, places like the ridge of the nose, cheekbones, things where a turn of the form might be catching light a little bit more strongly, a little stronger. And then let's see, where do I want to go with this? I think I want to add a little bit of light down here, sharpen up this edge here. Got a little muddy. So this is requiring a little bit of focus here. Sorry for the silence. I hope you all are, I hope your drawings are turning out. If you are new, again, if you are drawing along and you want to find the reference, it's in the description below. There's also a link to the show page on Artist Network where you can share your work when you're done. So here's a really good example of understanding the placement of a highlight. So if you look here, we have a ridge, kind of a form shadow, and then a valley where it's catching more of the light. Then we come up a wall here over to a peak, and so we get this brighter light here in the valley of that fold. And then we get a little bit more light here at the top of that. It's a little bit softer edge. And I'm just letting some of that natural haze kind of create that separation there. And now that really, just by breaking up that form in there, is really reinforcing that structure. It's just like what we did in the shadow shape where we're looking for some of those subtle variations of darks. Now we're in the light sides looking for some of those subtle variations in the light areas. So again, what I'm looking for are kind of prioritizing the turns in the form, so the peaks of these folds and then the valleys, and see what's happening there. Oh, Carolyn Green, I missed that. That is perfect. This one should be titled, "It's Curtains for You." I love it. Let's see. Adita say the bottom of the shadow is a little softer, lighter. I wonder which, I'm not quite sure which one. I'm going to soften this transition in here. It looks like it could be softer. And in here, I'm going to bring in a little bit of sharpness. And on this edge. So it's all very subtle at this point, but it's giving a little bit more form, adding some of these lighter highlights. In general, our eyes are really good at perceiving subtle shifts in value. And so, sometimes we can feel like a need to kind of exaggerate, and really kind of pump up the contrast. But sometimes that it makes the forms come alive. Right in here, I'm going to sharpen this edge up a little bit. And I think I'm going to largely leave this side. I don't know why. I'm doing it. And I'm going to maybe kind of sneak up on it to find that balance between it where it feels unfinished versus, I don't know, less refined. Ooh. So I'm happy with the addition of the white white charcoal here. Ooh, this right in here. I'm going to see what happens. So the reflected light is a bit stronger right in here. So I'm going to see what happens. And it talks so much about being mindful of those reflected lights. So, but if I feel like if I sneak up on it a little bit and I'm a little bit delicate with it, I can pump up the reflected light just a little bit more. So starting with a really light touch that really blends more than anything. I'm going to see what I can get away with. Especially I'm noticing down kind of in these lower, there must be something where the light is bouncing off a little bit more down in here. But I just want to make sure that, as I look at that reflected light, that it's not competing with that highlight. Where else can we do that? Oh yeah, right in here. Again, this feels like stripes rather than real form, so I'm going to play around with this a little bit, maybe do that. Smudge it a little bit, unify those forms a little bit so they don't appear as stripes. So just kind of, right now, it's fine-tuning, but it's not really substantively, I'm not doing anything new. I'm just kind of refining, building on some of the concepts we've already covered. So I think I'm going to start wrapping it up. I hope you'll join me again next week, 3 p.m. Eastern, because we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, for Drawing Together. Ooh, what are we doing? Oh, that right back there, that snow fox. That was a lot of fun to draw, but we're going to do that one. I think last year around this time we did like an Arctic hare or something, and it was so much fun capturing the light in the snow, and that's what this one was. It was a lot of fun. I'm going to work on it a little bit more, but that's what we'll be working on. Because every week we choose a different subject, and try to shake things up. So hopefully you share your work on Artist Network. Check out the link. It's in the description below. I encourage you to check out, if you're interested in learning more about my book, check out the links that I pinned to the top of the chat. So it's available for pre-order on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. Whew, this one is I'm exhausted now. This is a tough one, but a fun one. And so hopefully you have fun with it. If you haven't started your own drawing, enjoy the process, really. I think you're going to learn a lot that you can apply to any other subject, really. If you're intimidated by it, try to just take your time. Take a deep breath. If you need to walk away, come back to it. Take the pressure off yourself. Be kind to yourself. Because there's a lot of challenge in this, and a lot of this comes down to controlling the subtlety. So just keep at it. Fight through the drawing. And I would encourage you, like, if you really feel like it's falling apart, sometimes I'll hit a point where I'm like, there's nothing that's really going to reclaim this drawing. I'll continue on anyways, with the intention of learning something new throughout that process. So keep going for it. Even if you know like the drawing itself maybe is a waste, this becomes your playground when you can really start to experiment and discover something new. And sometimes freeing yourself up to just accepting that, right, this drawing is now a playground. It's not an expression of my absolute control over the material. Maybe you may discover something new and out of all of that. So go for it. So I want to thank you all for joining me. It's been a pleasure. So much fun to draw with you all. I will see you all next Wednesday. Have a great week.